They told me the case was solved, ribbon-tied, and filed under miracles. But there's a sound in the tape 32 seconds of something that no engineer can name. A breath that isn't a breath, like the city itself leaned in to whisper her home. I have played it at 2 a.m., alone more times than I'll admit. And every time, when the hiss clears, I hear my own name spoken by a voice that wasn't there. On paper, it ended in December of '82. A toddler taken in broad daylight, found alive 10 months later because an 11-year-old boy crawled through a roof vent and told the cops where to look. We celebrated. We posed for the grainy black and white. We shook hands until our knuckles hurt. But what we didn't print, what we didn't say into the cameras, was how the city began to misbehave the week before she was found, how streetlights blinked in threes when we passed the old Army Street yards, how our radios caught a frequency that carried a lullaby no one could place, and how a map slid off my wall, the pin for Concord rolling to a stop on a street it had no business finding. Maybe you don't believe in that sort of thing. 40 years of cases taught me skepticism too. But a solved case doesn't mean a simple case. If you let me, I'll tell you why some people vanish by hands, and some by corners, by the strange angles where light doesn't fully commit. I'll tell you how a city can keep a secret, and how, once in a while, it gets tired of the effort and lets one child go. This is the one time the city and I agreed. I wasn't on duty when the call came in that February. I was at the counter of a diner that used to sit 1 block from the Concord BART station, the kind of place that gave you eggs if you asked for coffee and charged you for both anyway. A Saturday. Families, parkas, the sweet static sound of a local radio. It was 2 minutes of peace in a month that hadn't offered many. The cook yelled someone's name mine, and I turned to see the beat cop run in with that look, the one you only get once in a career if you're lucky. He didn't need to say it out loud. I left a 5, grabbed my coat, and met the cold head-on. There's a cold only the Bay knows in February, a sting like wet foil, like you've bitten down on a bad filling. The parking lot where she went missing could have been any of 100. A chain grocery, 2 hardware stores, a laundromat with machines that shuddered like animals. The van door was open, the parents shaking in that quiet way that tells you their bodies are screaming, and the crowd's already forming a horseshoe with their fear. The father tried to stand straight. The mother's fingers kept finding the same fold on her scarf, as if it contained a zipper to some other time where this hadn't just happened. You learn to take a breath nobody sees. You root yourself to something. For me, it's always been names. The father told me theirs. The mother said the child's. I wrote it on my sleeve with a borrowed pen that didn't want to cooperate. The sky had that flat gray that never gives you clues. Somewhere, a cartwheel squealed. In my ear, the radio. Units fanned out. Shoe prints in the dust by the curb useless. A witness who said a van. Another who said it was a car. Someone who heard a door. Someone who swore a man with a limp. Noise, noise, noise. Kidnappings breed noise like hot pavement breeds mirage. You want a clean bath. You get static. You want a smoking gun. You get a cold breath that smells like radiator leak and someone's old cologne. You want a miracle. You get the neighbor who saw nothing and remembers everything. I started to canvass 3 rings out, then 5, then 9. Concord isn't a maze, but it pretends to be. Below the surface, streets stack like playing cards. If you're moving a child, you can erase yourself a dozen ways in 12 minutes. If you're praying, you memorize headlights and license plates like prayers. We prayed a lot. The first week is always a blur you only fully see later, like the negative of a photograph finally developed. I got myself a copy of her holiday picture the 3rd day. Big eyes, a grin she'd grow into. I slid it under the plastic of my badge wallet, where it pressed its face against mine every time I opened the flap. When the tip slowed, I changed my shift to overlap with night the hour liars get sloppy, and truth forgets to pull the curtains. It was in that hour I first felt watched by nothing in particular, the cobweb sense that something was evaluating me for flaws. I figured it for lack of sleep. Cops don't sleep. We power down for 2 hours and reboot. Lights still on. On day 8, our radios caught the lullaby. That's what everyone called it after the lullaby. Officially, it was interference. Unofficially, it came through on channels that weren't supposed to receive anything but us. And it sounded like a music box in a jar, like metal remembering a song. It played 3 bars, paused, repeated. Dispatch couldn't trace it. 2 techs swore it was crosstalk from a novelty station broadcasting music boxes. No such station existed. We wrote it down in the margins and didn't bring it up again. The way men don't mention a dream to other men unless it involves a boat or a deck. 3 weeks in, I stopped wearing my wedding ring. Habit, superstition, self-preservation, take your pick. I put it in the shallow bowl on my dresser at 4 a.m., saw the indentation on my skin as a confession, and walked back into the morning gray. That day, the streetlights in a 3-block stretch near the old yards flickered in a rhythm that made my neck prickle. 2 quick, 1 long. On the 3rd sequence, the bulb above me didn't just flicker. It went black, then flared so bright I saw the filament. I swore at the bulb. When you're exhausted, you get theatrical with inanimate objects. Then I noticed the map. Some people keep their maps clean, folding the creases like origami. Mine looked like it had spent a year at sea. Scotch tape in a dozen places, pencil underlines, coffee crescent moons. I'd pinned Concord, San Francisco's southeastern edge, the highways, the BART lines, Oakland piers, the dog-eared truck stops where nobody asks your name if your jacket is wrong for the weather. The pin for Concord vibrated. I thought it was the air vent. Then it popped free, rolled down the wall, hit the baseboard, and skittered under my desk. By the time I fished it out, it had found the same street, twice Army Street, the old industrial strip. A coincidence. I am loyal to coincidences until they prove themselves otherwise. In month 2, the tips got meaner. People who had nothing to do with anything called to confess to sins that made no sense, as if a child gone missing vacuumed guilt out of the county and made strangers want to get clean. You get used to the confessions. You inventory the town's loneliness. But once in a while, someone says a thing that paths you forward 2 inches. A woman whose son had run with transients said there was a van that never opened its side door in daylight, a van that seemed to sleep. She saw it in the yards once, she said, but didn't know which yard. The yards are a lot like the bay in fog. You can hear ships, but you can't swear they weren't only in your head. By month 4, I started talking to the city like it could talk back. In the unmarked, rolling the late shift, I'd narrate my route the way my old man narrated baseball. If you've got her, I'd say to the lights, just blink once when I'm warm. Once it obliged with 2. I laughed, felt stupid, and a chill that felt like childhood fevers. We put up more flyers. We shook more trees. The lullaby came back nights, always 3 bars, always off key at the end, like someone with cold hands winding the mechanism too tight. The boy came in month 10. He didn't come to us. He slid through a hole nobody patched where an old wall met a rusted gate, crossed a lot that belonged to no one, and climbed down a ladder into the kind of basement room the city uses to stash things it doesn't want to admit to owning. He was 11 on paper and about 6 in the bones. He said a name that wasn't his. He asked for water, and when he held the cup, the tremor ran up the plastic like a wire. The intake nurse had the kind of voice that can file reports while soothing toddlers, and she used it like an instrument. The boy's story fell out in little stones, each one with a shine we couldn't ignore. There was a van, he said. It moved at night, the way bad weather moves slow, without declaring itself. There were rules for when you could look at the floor and when you couldn't. There were places where the van could sleep without getting noticed. It liked the industrial edges, places that forgot to dream big. He said there was a little kid who slept folded like a paper crane, who sometimes didn't talk for whole days, who had been taught the wrong name and half the wrong words. He said grown-ups hurt you in ways that weren't always bruises. He had a name for one of them. He called him a frog because his throat clicked when he swallowed. We filmed the interview with a camera that always made the room look smaller than it was. The boy's eyes tracked the red light on the camera like it was a coal. When he said the place, he didn't say it all at once. He said it like a person who's learned that telling the truth in the wrong tempo is the same as lying. The yards off Army Street. A fence with a corrugated panel that sounded like rain even when there wasn't rain. A view of a smokestack that worked some days and wheezed most. In my pocket, the pin I'd stopped returning to the map dug a reminder into my thigh. We went fast without spooking. The city at night looks like a decision nobody finalized, and that night it looked particularly undecided. Fog came from the south, the kind the weather guy calls advection and the rest of us call trouble. I drove without sirens, a metronome going in my chest that didn't match any clock. The lullaby didn't come through the radio, but it threaded the air the way a remembered song does when you can't get a chorus. I have had adrenaline before. That night wasn't adrenaline. It was something quieter, like Dread's older brother, the one that tries to keep you from stepping through the wrong door by putting a hand on your collar. You want the Hollywood moment. You get a gate with a chain you can cut in half a second, or fiddle with for a minute that feels like a year. We cut it. We pushed into a lot that had collected the wreckage of 2 decades appliances abandoned by divorces, wire spools as big as rooms, a school bus missing its seats and soul. The van wasn't hiding. Hiding would have been amateur. It sat as if it had earned the right. There's a way metal looks when it has been slept in. The skin of it gets a memory. This van had that memory written in dense and dull shine. We took the angles we were trained to take. You never want to put a clean line between you and an unknown. We flowed. No noise we didn't choose. At the window, you can learn a lot by the kind of dirt you see. New dirt is shiny. Old dirt is matte. Dirt that's been breathed on has a track. The side window had the fog print of someone exhaling slowly. My partner counted down with his eyes. I nodded with mine. The handle gave like a tooth you thought would fight you longer. The smell stole language for a second. Then there was space, then a narrow bed, then a body too small under a sheet too thin, then another body with the wrong amount of hair, then us like an eclipse. Someone said words that I can't remember now. I remembered the city making a sound I had heard only once before, and didn't know I had been waiting to hear again. An involuntary exhale. When a child looks at you after something like that, you want the look to bless you into usefulness. You want it to knight you as someone who did something that mattered. You usually get confusion, then fear of you, then a reach for whatever passes as familiar. A corner, a piece of fabric, the edge of a mattress. She didn't know her name. We knew it. We didn't say it. We said nothing soft, nothing that needed to be remembered forever. We gave the scripted phrases our instructors wrote on the chalkboard years ago. She didn't answer. There's a quality of silence that belongs only to the very young and the very old, the first learning words, the second learning how to put them down. She had that silence. The boy's name wasn't the boy's name. He clung to the doorframe like it had promised him something and needed to make good. The men inside didn't run. That tells you something about a person. Running is faith. Staying is either arrogance or emptiness. The one everyone later called Tree Frog watched us the way big cats watch things that move fast. The younger one shook, a tremor that made a zipper sound. My partner cuffed the older. I cuffed the younger. When you touch someone like that, your fingertips learn something no academy can teach. You learn if a person has a temperature that's human. He was too cool, like a person who had stood too long near cold iron. The girl left the van in a blanket that had belonged to the ambulance, which is to say, it had belonged to 100 people in 100 emergencies. She wore it like a different species of weather. In the hospital light later, she kept her eyes half closed, as if the world had become too loud to look at. I stood outside her room and tried to turn into furniture the way cops do when we need to be present but not human. The doctor moved in with hands that had learned to speak louder than voices. Nurses did the quiet work, the world scaffolding. If the story ended there, it would be enough for most. Solved, found alive. 10 months erased with a word every parent wants more than any lottery. Alive. But that night did not end. It changed color. They took her fingerprints. We waited. My coffee turned the color of old pennies. When the confirmation came, it didn't come with a trumpet. It arrived in a nurse's steps, and the clerk's voice calling my last name like it was the punchline to a joke too heavy to lift. "She's your girl," the clerk said, like I had asked for proof of something only God normally provides. Later, when everyone had done a version of crying, and men were trying not to make it about themselves, I took the tape from the radio car. The lullaby had never recorded before, not once in 10 months. That night, it had 32 seconds. 3 bars, the stop, 3 bars, the stop, and then not me, not anyone we had on the scene, someone saying my name the way my grandmother used to when she wanted to wake me without scaring me. I played it twice alone. The second time, I smiled like a fool. The third time, I turned the volume down to the point where the hiss was louder than the tune. I put it in an evidence sleeve and wrote too neatly on the label. I could end here and tell you the rest is paperwork and therapy, and the kind of justice that turns men into furniture for decades. I could say the city exhaled, and that was that. But you're here because you suspect what I suspected the week after the hospital. When I woke at 3:11 a.m. with the certainty of a man who remembers where he left the spare key, I drove to Army Street without a reason anyone would have signed off on. The fog was lower than a promise. The lot was empty of vans and full of the memory of them. And in the place where her small bed had pressed the metal, my flashlight found it. A thin, unnaturally straight streak of soot up the inside of the van wall, like someone had set a candle there and let it burn without fire, a seam where heat had lived with nothing to feed it. You don't have to believe me. I barely do. But I traced that line with a gloved finger, and the residue clung and didn't mark the glove. A mark that did not wish to be evidence. I turned off the light and stood with the dark. The lullaby didn't play. Something else did, a rhythm not for ears. 2 quick, 1 long. The streetlights answered a second later. The map pin in my pocket was warm. You came for a solved case. You'll get it. But you'll also get a different kind of ledger, one that balances with strange arithmetic. We lost 10 months and got her back. Somewhere, someone added 3 bars of music to a silence and called it even. And somewhere else, the city promised me one favor yet to be named. I said yes before I knew the terms. If you'll stay, I'll tell you what it asked for. The favor came due 3 days after the hospital, when the cameras had retreated to the curb and the headlines slid from ink to recycling. A quiet hour, the kind that always makes you suspicious after noise. I was back at the station filling out forms that have outlived better men when the desk sergeant handed me a message from a payphone near the Portola district. No voice, just a sequence of tones like someone who didn't know how to talk to machines, but was trying anyway. 2 quick, 1 long. Then 3 bars of that tune you don't have to believe in to hear. I drove over without telling anyone because explaining a feeling to people in uniform ages who 10 years. The Portola pay phone sat curbside, glass scabbed with old stickers, and the kind of graffiti that looks less like letters than a city's handwriting left-handed. In the change return was a plastic charm in the shape of a butterfly. The color used to be yellow. It had lost the argument to sunlight. The chain was long gone. Butterflies, I thought. Freedom, I guessed. It felt too on the nose, like the city had developed a sense of humor while I wasn't looking. Across the street, a laundromat door chimed the way small decisions do. I wasn't here for laundry or symbols. I was here because the lullaby had stepped out of the radio and into coin slots. It made me feel like a rube, but I walked the block anyway, hands in pockets, pretending the day had nothing on me. A boy on a BMX bike circled twice, scraped one foot on the curb to stop his momentum, and stared without hiding it. Kids are detectives with fewer rules. He said, "You're the one that found the girl." I told him nobody finds anyone alone. He wrinkled his nose like I'd ducked a pitch. He said the van used to sleep by the pallets behind the blue door. Then he forgot me like kids do when they've given their offering to the god of adults and expected nothing back. The blue door was a cinder block door painted in the color you get when you ask for blue, and the clerk says, "We're out of the good kind." Inside was a skinny storage corridor and the smell of pallets that had absorbed every story they'd spent years propping up. You can smell bad secrets if you stand still enough. They smell like wet magnesium. I walked without touching anything. Halfway in, I saw the scuff on the floor where a heavy thing with old rubber tires had pivoted too tight and left a halo. The halo pointed to an inside door that wasn't supposed to be there, the sort of door you get when a contractor does a favor for a friend and nobody files a permit. Behind that door was a room with a concrete floor and paint giving up at the corners. A rectangle cut long and mean by fluorescent tubes that flickered the rhythm I'd started to believe was following me. Two quick, one long. It could have been bad ballast. It could have been me. Against the far wall sat a rolling wire rack crowned with the kind of cheap plastic flowers you buy in a hurry for graves you plan to visit only once. The second shelf had a folded blanket the color of an old bruise. The bottom shelf held 3 cassette tapes stacked like little gravestones. No labels. Generic. You can tell a man's level of arrogance by whether he labels his sins. I didn't have a warrant, and I didn't want one. Some rooms you're not sure you should introduce to the court system. Some rooms you just need to introduce to your nerves and pour bleach on your nerves later. I picked up a tape. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It didn't want to tell me anything. I slid it into the pocket of a coat that had known worse. When I turned to go, the overhead tube settled on steady, as if satisfied I'd made the right choice. If I told you that made me grateful, you'd think I'd lost my edge. Maybe I had. The Boy Mac. I'd learned his name and didn't know if it would ever be the right one, was housed where people tried to stitch kids back together without calling the needle what it is. He watched the television like it owed him money. He didn't like adults' eyes. He liked doors and where they might lead. When I stepped in that afternoon, he didn't look up. I told him about the BMX kid, because sometimes kids need to hear kids are helping. He lifted an eyelid, BMX, and went back to the TV at helping. I asked him if Tree Frog ever parked near Portola. He shrugged the way boys shrug when a truth is heavy. Shrugging is a lever. I placed the plastic butterfly on the table between us. He flinched like it had hissed. Then he pushed it to the edge with one finger and let it fall. He said they meant metamorphosis. He said it like he was reading from a manual, like the word had been fed to him with electric wire around it. He didn't look at me when he said people can turn into better things if they learn the rules. I wanted him to have other nouns than he. I wanted him to have rooms with windows that didn't promise anything and still felt kind. You can mistake pity for help if you're not careful. I've made that mistake. I told him the truth that doesn't help anyone in the moment, but sometimes buys you credibility later. Rules that hurt kids aren't rules. They're props for cowards. He didn't smile. He did shift an inch toward existing at my table. That's a win in certain currencies that don't spend at the grocery. The tape was not something I wanted to listen to alone, but there are times you learn more from a thing before it joins a chain of custody that turns it into an exhibit instead of a story. I drove home at a speed that made my old steering wheel complain. The player in my living room had eaten exactly one cassette in 7 years. I cleaned the heads like a man preparing a ritual. The hiss came first, the ocean you don't live near anymore, but carry inside you from childhood. Then the clack of a switch being flipped by an unseen hand. Then the music. It was not the lullaby. It was the sound of a city's arteries. Fans, distant train brakes, water through old pipes, a dog complaining of floor below, the human hum that leaks under doors. Then breath too close to the mic. Then a voice reciting a list in the tone of a professor in love with his vocabulary. Metamorphosis, transubstantiation, translation. 3. Words that think they mean the same thing to people who enjoy being wrong. Then silence. Then the voice again, lower. The city does not love you. The city endures you. If you want love, learn to be a moth and burn well. I stopped the tape because anger is a sound too, and I was making it. I rewound 10 seconds, pressed play, and wrote each word down in a hand that looked neater than mine. Somewhere in there, a radiator ticked. Somewhere a door breathed. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't a confession. It was a philosophy of harm. Men like that build cathedrals out of $5 words and bad light. The part of me that has made a home in ordinary evil didn't flinch. The part of me that had heard my name on a tape that hadn't recorded a thing for months wondered whether I'd been invited to a sermon nobody asked for. I could have taken it in that night. I didn't. It's the sort of confession that needs to be found twice to mean what it means. First by a cop, then by the paperwork. I put it in a bread box that lost its bread years ago and hid it under dog-eared manuals about radios and a dictionary with a cracked spine. Don't worry, everything that needs to be logged gets logged. But sometimes you let a thing sit in your house long enough for your house to tell you what it is. At 2 a.m, my house practiced its vocabulary of old wood. The heater coughed in the way that made me fear it would die on the only cold night we'd get that year. I slept in a chair because beds felt like promises. The dream, if that's what you call it, came not as pictures but as geometry. Edges that didn't meet, angles that didn't show their work, a floor that decided to keep going past the wall. When I woke, a map had fallen off the nails it had clung to since Carter, and the pin god bless the pin had rolled again, this time to a spot I hadn't charted because it made no sense. A triangle of streets near the rail spur by Islay Creek, where nothing much happens except the business of being industrial. The city's spleen. 3 favors, the city seemed to say. I've given you 2. Don't make me regret the 3rd. I didn't tell anyone I was going, because the men I work with are good, and goodness deserves not to be dragged into my private pacts with municipalities. Dawn was a rumor behind clouds. The rail spur looked like a museum of iron. I parked in the shadow of a warehouse, whose windows had been painted shut with a paint that always looks wet. The world smelled like brake dust and salt, and something sweeter under it that made me think of cheap frosting. I walked the perimeter like a dog trying to find its bed in a motel. Halfway down the block, I found the blessing I didn't want. A half-buried Polaroid, corner chewed by weather, plastic peeling from the paper. I didn't pick it up. I knelt and looked instead. 2 corners showed the telltale wash of flash on metal, and the edge of a floral print blanket that might have been the twin of the one we pulled from the van. There's a way Polaroids age that makes the colors lie. They turn skin to sugared wax. The urge to touch wars with the urge to burn. I slid it onto a piece of cardboard using an envelope I should have used for bills, and into a bag that rattled like a conscience. A gate ahead had a lock that wasn't serious about its job. The chain had seen newer, harsher unions in its day. I got lucky with the angle. And the lever? The yard beyond held the old bones of machines that gave up when the city asked them to turn one more time, and they said no. In the far corner, someone had been making small fire's rings of soot, the ghost outlines of cans. Not unusual. The unusual part was the line of soot on the cinder block wall, a perfect seam up and up until it met the outflow vent, and then continued, as if the soot had found a path through solid, as if the wall had decided it wasn't the wall all the way up. I said out loud, "Don't do this to me." The city didn't answer with lights this time. It answered with a smell like a match put out in your fingers. My breath condensed and hung there longer than it should have, like the air was thicker by a degree you can't measure. The sound came next. Not music, no. That would have been too kind, but the echo of a rhythm in the metal of the fence when nothing was touching it, as if something on the other side of the wall had knocked twice and then once and asked if we were home. A truck down the block backfired, and the moment broke like a cheap plate. I stood there feeling rude, the way you feel when you walk into a room and people stop talking, which is the city's way of letting you know you've come close enough to the center for now. On the way out, the gate didn't want to close, and I apologized to it, because lack of sleep makes you new kinds of polite. At 9, I did the thing you do when you want to test whether you've made all this up. I told a piece of it to someone who thinks you're smarter than you are. Her name was Lavra, and she belonged to the sergeant who'd done more than his job with the girl. Lavra was on the way to becoming something like family to the rescued child. She had a kitchen that smelled like cookie dough, regardless of whether cookies were being made. I said, "Funny thing, the kid's into butterflies." She said, "Of course she is, who isn't after a cage." It was so simple, I wanted to shake her hand. It also made the charm in my pocket feel less like a message and more like a coincidence that didn't owe me a drink after all. The tape, though. The tape was not a charm. I signed it into evidence that afternoon because sooner or later the good guys have to be accountable to something besides weather and private rituals. The tech gave me the look they give when they're grateful you came early in the day and didn't hand them a nightmare at 5. He ran the levels, checked the noise floor, did the shrug that says, "It's real enough to be annoying." When he asked me, "Want me to enhance the voice?" I said, "Let it sit." He said, "It'll sit better with a case number." I gave him the digits I'd been pretending I didn't have memorized. When a case re-enters the light, the press returns like birds to a field that's been plowed new. A local wanted the human angle, the boy hero, the persevering cop, the transformation of grief into action. It was the kind of story a city tells itself when it needs to believe it's worth the taxes. I stood on camera and said the words men in ties find noble. We don't give up. Our community stands together. Evil is not as organized as it wants you to think. In the shade just off frame, Mac watched the reporter's mouth move like a puppet and learned a new distrust that we would have to spend down later. That night, to make it up to a universe that keeps ledgers we don't get to audit, I drove the long way home through streets that taught me how to be poor with dignity years before I had a badge. The radio didn't sing. The lights behaved. The map stayed on the wall as if it had decided to be civilized. I almost let myself think that the city had finished its errands through me, that I could put the geometry away and go back to rounding corners with 2 feet and a decent pair of boots. Then the phone rang, and a voice I hadn't expected to hear again said my last name with a new grammar. It was the mother. Her words were the words of a woman trying to learn how to be happy without apologizing to sorrow. She said she's sleeping, finally. Then she said she woke and asked for her long hair back. I said the only thing there was to say, which was that we were making a list of everything to return, and hair was on it. Then she said, There's a bruise on her wrist in the shape of a moth. And she laughed in that way. People laugh when something scares them so much, they try to make it tiny. I asked, a butterfly? She said, no, a moth. Butterflies are daytime lies. Moths are what come when the light hurts. I wrote it down because once you start writing the city's jokes in your notebook, you can't stop. And because the difference between moth and butterfly felt like the difference between a happy ending and the thing we actually get. A good ending with a cost folded into it, payable in installments. If you want me to say I solved anything right then, I won't. What I did was more ordinary and more faithful. I showed up the next morning at the hospital with a stuffed dog that looked like it had opinions and a book about insects that told the truth with pictures. I read the captions in a voice I hadn't used since my own kids still thought my voice could quiet the dark. The girl looked and didn't look, and when the page with the moths came up, she touched the paper once with a finger that would one day flip through 100 good magazines that felt nothing like this one. She said a word that wasn't a word, and everyone pretended to know what it meant, so she wouldn't have to say it again. That evening, Mac asked for a window seat he could open. The staff said no, not unkindly. He said, I want to hear the real air. I offered the courtyard. He wanted sky and noise, and the random arguments of somebody else's life through thin glass. It was the kind of request a cop has no business granting. I asked the nurse for a bend, and she gave me one, because every good institution keeps one bend in its pocket per week. We sat by a third-floor window with a stubborn latch and listened to a city trying to decide between fog and not. He said, if I tell you a thing, will you put it somewhere safe that isn't a box? I said yes, because my head is a bad neighborhood, and I know how to patrol it. He said he used to talk to the city like it was a person, but he thought the city was a man who liked him. He asked it for places to park, and it told him where to be. He said the city told him where to find the girl, and that it owed him for something from before. I asked before what? He said, before I remember. I said, the city doesn't owe men like him a thing. He said, maybe it doesn't, but it likes to keep score. There it was, the ledger again, the old arithmetic. I wanted to borrow the boy's faith and give it a healthier object. Instead, I gave him a story that wasn't a lie. I told him my father used to say that streets are like streams. They'll take you where you ask if you ask nicely, and don't try to control the whole river. You can float better than you can fight. He said, but what if the river wants you? I said, then you point your toes downstream, and you keep your head up, and you look for someone on the bank who's paying attention. He nodded like I'd said something a coach would say, and coaches get more room in a kid's head than cops. At midnight, my house turned on its own lamps. The bulb in the hallway that had been dead for a week glowed once, a pulse, and quit. I've learned that if you treat a house like a nervous animal, it will stop knocking over the water bowl. I told it I saw it. I told it we had 2 favors left between us, mine to it and its to me. Then I slept the way soldiers sleep between shells. Morning felt honest for the first time in a long month. The headlines had stiff-chinned optimism, the kind a city prefers, because it can point children at it and say, see, we are not our worst story. I stopped for coffee strong enough to peel paint, and, because superstition starts humble and gets worse, I took a route I hadn't taken in years. The road cut behind an old factory, repurposed as offices nobody wants to work in because the walls remember soot. On the chain-link fence, someone had tied strips of yellow fabric like prayers. The first one read hope in a Sharpie bold with anger. The second had a child's drawing of a moth. I didn't take that as a sign. I took it as a reminder to be the kind of man who does not flinch at patterns. The job isn't to banish strangeness. The job is to keep it from recruiting. By lunch, the lab called. The tape had a second voice on it, faint, under the breath in the sermon. A shadow voice speaking in the kind of whisper you use when you're trying to keep a baby asleep. It wasn't a word the tech could decode. It was a named shape. He said, "Sounds like yours, but I don't want to be the guy who hears his own name in the wind." I thanked him and didn't go upstairs, because there are some days when you don't layer new madness on old until you've had a sandwich. You wanted a solved case. You deserve one. The men are in steel. The girl is alive. The boy is learning new nouns. All true. Also true, some nights the grid of this city hums at a frequency between guilt and mercy, and if you're up when it does, it will ask you to carry a corner of something heavy. You can say no. You can move to the desert and pretend empty is easier. Or you can say yes once, and then the city has your number on a small card under its ashtray, and when it needs you again, it will dial. That evening, the city dialed with Rain Real Rain for the first time in weeks, drumming the exact tempo of 2 quick, 1 long on my kitchen window. I laughed at myself and put a pot under the leak that only appears when the storm comes from the southwest. I said, "Fine, one more favor tonight. But after that, you leave the kids alone." Then I put on my coat and went to meet a man who thinks soot can climb through concrete and talk. He was waiting where men like him always wait, in a diner with a jukebox that doesn't know it's broken and a pie case that lies with confidence. He had the kind of hair that holds onto grease like it's afraid to be alone. He smiled and showed too many teeth, and none of them matched. He said my name like we were cousins. He said, "I hear you like tapes." I said nothing because dignity is contagious if you give it a minute. He slid a cassette across the table. He said, "He left me more sermons than I can spend, and you seem like a tither." I said, "How much?" He said, "Enough to pay for pie." I said, "We're all preachers now. If you're waiting for the part where I take him by the collar and make a scene, it isn't that kind of story. It's slower, meaner, more practical. I paid for the pie and the tape with cash that my accountant has never loved." Outside, the rain changed key. Under the awning, the man said, he said the city hates light that stays still. He said, "Keep moving and it won't pin you." He laughed like he had made that up. He hadn't. Men like him never make anything up. They borrow, they rot, they deliver. I walked to my car with the tape in my pocket, and the understanding that favors given to a city aren't owed by the city, but by whatever in you agrees to be useful. Back home, I did not press play. I put the tape next to the first, now properly in a chain that would turn it into evidence and not myth. I brewed coffee I didn't need. I watched the rain make lace on the street, and I waited for the phone to ring, because sometimes the play calls you before you call it. It didn't. Instead, the house settled. The radiator made its vow to survive, and the hallway bulb did not throb one time to show me it could. The quiet had an edge like a paper cut you find doing dishes. When it was late enough for good men to be asleep and bad men to be 2/3 through their shifts, I stepped onto the porch and listened. The lullaby didn't come. Across the street, a neighbor's TV glowed blue and white, like the ocean arguing with the shore. I thought about metamorphosis and moths, and the vanity of men who believe big words can erase small crimes. I thought about a girl asleep in a bed that did not smell like metal. I thought about a boy who wanted a window to argue with. Then the power cut for 1 second and came back. When it did, every clock in the house blinked 12 o'clock in agreement. In that blink, the city spoke not with a song, but with a choice. Come now, or come later, and find less. I went now. And that, if you'll keep your seat and your patience, is how the solved case walked me to the third door and taught me that a city's gratitude is a promise written in pencil on a wet day. The third door looked like nothing. A service entrance with paint the color of regret and a sign that read employees only in a font that hadn't been fashionable since bicentennial bunting. The rain had practiced all afternoon and now performed. drumming the corrugated awnings, turning alley trash into small boats with heroic destinies. I knocked because sometimes being polite spooks the right person more than a badge. 2 knocks quick, 1 slow. Old habits. No one answered. The lock thought about its responsibilities and decided to take the night off. Inside, a corridor led to a room with a vending machine that sold nothing worth the calories. A bulletin board with pushpins like confetti frozen midair, and a smell of bleach that hadn't gotten the job done. Somewhere above, a machine sighed in cycles. Buildings breathe like animals when they're older than their promises. I wasn't here alone. I was here with a feeling, the way a fisherman is with a tide. The tape with the sermon had earned its evidence tag. The second tape sat in my coat like a tooth you don't touch with your tongue. A staircase led down where blueprints would have sworn there was no down. That's the thing about cities. They're good at secrets because they're built in layers. And the layer that talks isn't always the one that owns the lease. The basement was wide enough for regret to echo. Racks of cleaning supplies stood like monks in a cloister. In the far corner, a door with a hand-painted moth above the handle in chalk. The chalk had run in the damp, so the moth looked like it had been crying. I touched the outline, and my finger came away clean. A mark that did not wish to be evidence, again. Somewhere in the ductwork, a fan coughed twice, then once. You don't need an interpreter. You need a backbone. Inside, the walls were the color of old newspaper left in sun. The floor stained in a way that didn't tell you what the story had been. A folding table held a boom box with its guts splayed tasteful as taxidermy. Next to it, not tapes, photographs, a dozen Polaroids laid like a deck, face down. There is a way to touch Polaroids. Halfway reverent, halfway ready to burn them in your sink. I flipped the top card. It was a corner of Van metal, and a small hand in the bottom left, fingers curled, a crease at the wrist that told you the child slept or had learned to imitate sleep in order to be safe. The second image, blurred motion, a man's flannel sleeve, and the edge of a cheap plastic butterfly charm. The third, a blank white that Polaroids sometimes give you when they're shy or the light lies. The fourth, the table I stood at from a higher angle, as if someone had been practicing seeing this room before I walked into it, before anyone should have. You learn to set aside fear in Tupperware with a good seal. I flipped until I hit the one I knew was waiting. The moth bruise on a small wrist, 3 shades darker than skin, the shape symmetrical enough to be a trick of pressure, asymmetrical enough to be a thing no one deserves. I felt older than my bones and newer than my name. I put the pictures back face down because the room felt like it preferred that. There was a notebook beside the boombox, a cheap spiral with the wire coming loose at the back, and a cover that still had the price sticker. The handwriting inside leaned toward ritual print letters, all caps, the faith of a man who believes in rules as magic. Pupation schedule. It read at the top of one page, and I had to sit down because sometimes laughter starts where crying is supposed to go. Below, times, places, instructions to self. Do not be seen. Do not be kind. Do not use names. There are commandments that tell on a man. A voice behind me said, "You're trespassing." I turned slow, because sudden is for rabbits, and I'm not a rabbit. The janitor's jacket looked real and then didn't, the way a costume from a good thrift store does under fluorescent light. He held a mop like a staff, and his left eye had an old injury that made it look like it was perpetually trying to remember where it had left the truth. He said, "This room is storage." I said, "Everything's storage if you wait long enough." He didn't like the answer. He liked that someone had come and would leave. He had a kind of stillness men earn by not being chaste enough when they were young. I showed him the polite half of the badge. He decided to be helpful in that way that gives you less than you need, but enough to keep you from kicking the door down. He said, "Kids leave charms in laundromats, officer. Moths like light. People like stories. Somebody drew a picture. Somebody took some pictures. Nothing to be done about that. Let's lock up and go home. You listen for what a man doesn't say? He had no curiosity about the Polaroids, which meant he had too much. He wanted me to walk him out and bless this room with departure. I said, "You ever hear music on radios down here when there's no radio on?" He said, "Radios play radio." The kind of answer that tells you a lot by telling you nothing. I wrote his name down from his tag, knowing it might not be a true thing, the way names sometimes aren't. Outside, the rain had argued itself into honesty. The street reflected a better city than the one above it. On the way to the car, a woman under a leaky awning said to nobody, "They find that little girl, right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." That made all kinds of shadows pull back off the brick for a breath. If you do this work long enough, you collect small yeses and spend them on nights like this. I took the Polaroids and the notebook to the station because there's only so much ritual a man should keep in his house before the walls learn the wrong words. The tech asked if I wanted the residue powders. I said, "Try the edges and the backs." Bad men believe they are only vulnerable on the fronts of things. He smiled like that was a joke worth keeping. He powdered, he brushed, he breathed light and patience on junk. 2 partials, 1 decent ridge pattern on the notebook's back cover. It was enough to feel like progress, and not enough to be called victory. The second tape had to be played, or it would rot into myth. The lab has a setup that makes angels of ugliness. Filters that don't lie, knobs that don't pretend to be more important than they are. We threaded it. The hiss greeted us like an old friend. Underneath, a room tone different from the first tapes, more metallic, higher ceiling, less water in the walls. Then a voice I didn't know and still knew. Not Tree Frog, the younger man. The tremor that made his words zippered. He was reading. Manuals do this to men. They make them believe reading a thing aloud will make it true. He said, "The city rewards metamorphosis." He said, "The cocoon is kindness. The world outside is chaotic. Inside we can control variables." He said, "The old names do not belong to the new forms." He said, "The moths come to the light because they are learning to do better." He said, "Don't make me go outside." His voice broke. You can edit out hiss. You can't edit out a vocal cord that's learned 2 decades of fear in 2 years. At the 32-second mark, the tape did a thing the first one had done. It hiccuped. Then there was breath. Then there was my name, soft, the way a person who trusts you says it when they ask for water in the night. The tech looked at me the way you look at someone who finally admits he's been hearing ghosts. I said, "Roll it again." He did. The name stayed. Voices don't graft onto tape without help. The help was nothing we had a manual for. I signed the chain and walked out into an air that had decided to be clean for 20 minutes. I made it to the car before the second favor showed itself again. A woman leaned on my driver's side fender, soaked, hair stringing down the way rain makes hair into a younger person's. She had a grocery bag with nothing in it but a loaf of bread and a roll of duct tape. She said, "You're the man in the paper." I said, "The paper likes my tie." She said, "No, the girl." "Thank you for being the tool." I said, "That's all I ever wanted to be." Her eyes did the math on my face and found a sum she could live with. She said, "The moths in my building keep dying on the hallway light. Do you think that means anything?" I said, "It means you should change the bulb." Then I said, "Or it means you should paint the rim darker." She laughed like I'd given her a magic trick. Sometimes we get to... Back at my house, the map behaved, which was almost worse. When the city goes quiet after shouting, you don't trust the quiet. I made a sandwich that had no talent and ate it like it might keep me alive another hour. The phone rang because phones believe in symmetry. The sergeant's number. He said, The mother's asking whether we've got anyone who can tell her what to do about the bruise. I said, tell her to take pictures every day for a week. Light the same. Keep the arm in the same position. Don't try to make it anything. Let the days do the work. I hung up and looked at my own arm in a way men do when they get old enough to understand that bodies tell stories you can't erase with willpower. A pale line from a childhood bike spill. A thumbnail nick from a kitchen argument with a can of beans. I thought about how strange it is that we call some marks scars and some bruises when the difference is mostly calendar work. Then I thought about the door down there, and the chalk moth, and the way soot had learned to climb. Near midnight, a neighbor knocked, the kind of knock that apologizes while it happens. She's in her 60s and has a dog that looks like a question mark made of fur. She said, sorry to bother, but my back door is being temperamental, and the lock is. She didn't finish the sentence because saying, the lock is afraid of the dark, makes you the sort of person other people tell jokes about. I took a look, because that's a currency too. The lock wasn't afraid. It had been asked to do too much. The wood had swollen. The door had learned the shape of stuck. I jimmied it with a patience I wish I showed people more often. On her kitchen counter sat a child's drawing. 2 stick figures, a square van, a moth in the sky the size of a kite. I didn't comment. She didn't offer. On the way out, the dog flipped its head to watch a corner like corners sometimes make their own weather. I told the dog, me too. We are all connoisseurs of corners, whether we admit it or not. Sleep took me like a mugger who apologizes afterward. In the morning, the tape player in the living room had turned itself on, which is not a thing mechanical objects do, unless a human or the world decides. The counter reads 032. I let myself be angry at the number, because anger is a handhold on a cliff you didn't plan to climb. I turned it off and told the empty room, enough. Work is the place you go to be ordinary on purpose. I wanted ordinary. I sat at my desk and filled forms that would outlive me and my bad handwriting. A rookie asked whether it ever stops feeling like drowning. I said, swimming is just drowning. We practice until it looks like dance. He laughed and will forget that I said it until one night he won't, and then he'll call me if I'm still around, or he'll talk to the wall I used to stand against. At lunchtime, a package arrived with no return address. Inside, a cassette, of course, and a note printed from a dot matrix printer like a relic. The note said, we can help each other. He is not the only one who prays to concrete. Meet me where the creek pretends to be a river. There are only a handful of places in this city where a creek remembers how to lie like that. Isle, obviously. A trap, obviously. Also, maybe, a person who had decided their fear needed a partner. People think cops run at traps because we have hero complexes. The truth is less cinematic. We go because if the trap is for us, it will be for someone who can't afford it next. The sun called in sick. The day never found its color. I wore the coat that makes me look like I know more than I do. The creek smelled like a rail yard and mercy. Under the bridge, tagged concrete told the city's teenage autobiography in colors that deserve better weather. A figure stood in the half-light, hands in pockets, shoulders apologizing for the head they were attached to. He wasn't Tree Frog. He was a man who had orbited harm and come back with sunburn. He said, I'm not a good man. I said, good men are a luxury item. He said, he thinks the city is a woman. He talks to it like a mother who never said no. He said the child was a gift for doing a favor. I said, what favor? He said, he didn't tell me. He said, the van isn't the only room. I didn't move. He said, there's a place where the moths go when they die, and if you put your ear to the concrete, you can hear wings. He cried like he'd run out of other verbs. He handed me the cassette like it was poison he didn't want in his pocket anymore, then asked me to turn around so he could walk away without me knowing the shape of his leaving. I let him. Sometimes dignity is protection. The tape wanted to be played right there. I didn't. The bridge hummed something you feel in dental work. I took it to the lab and watched the needle do its neat dance. Hiss, breath, room tone. Then a sound that wasn't the city, wasn't machinery, wasn't wind. A friction of paper on paper or wings on something not air. The tech frowned and turned a dial too gently to be science. Under the friction, a voice that wasn't human. Not animal either, the shape of saying without words. I could say it spelled my name. I won't. It spelled attention. It spelled no. That night, the mother called again, and her voice had found a steadiness that made me proud for reasons no manual approves. She said, "The bruise is lighter, but the shape is clearer." I said, "That's how some things go. The edges sharpen as the color forgives." She said, "She asked if moths get to be butterflies if they've been good." I said, "Some stay moths and learn to love the light from farther away so it doesn't burn them." She said, "That's sad." I said, "That's survival." She said, "Thank you for being precise." Precision is a kind of kindness when the world is big enough to get lost in. At 2 a.m, the hall bulb gave one pulse and quit for real. I stood under it and laughed, because a man has to put his fear somewhere, or it will put itself in his bones. I got the ladder, replaced the bulb, and when I came down the steps, I realized my house had an extra shadow that didn't belong to things. It wasn't a person. It was a shape at the corner of the map where Islay Creek turns like a dog finding a bed. The pin didn't move. The shadow did. It crawled up the wall to the nail and stopped, like a moth deciding whether the light was worth the cost. This is the part where a different narrator would tell you about a sage, a priest, a specialist in theologies of concrete and wire. I had none. I had a city that liked to knock twice and once, a kid who wanted a window to argue with, a mother who said words precisely like they were tools, a map that had turned into a partner with bad habits, and a case we called solved because the right person slept in the right bed again. The unsolved part wasn't what it always is, not who, not how, not even why. The unsolved part was the economy of favors the city had written in its invisible ink. At dawn, the phone rang like it was late to its own life. The voice was Laura's, steady as a shelf. She said, "She's awake and humming." Not the lullaby, something else. I held the silence because sometimes if you don't say anything, people will give you the true shape without editing. She said, 3 notes, but happy. She said, "Do you think that means anything?" I said, "It means the city can learn." She said, "Cities don't learn." I said, "Then we do for them." I dressed like a man who had a plan and left like a man who didn't. On the way out, I tapped the map like a friend's shoulder. At the curb, a moth dead against the street lamp felt like theater. I picked it up anyway and put it in a matchbox because respect is free and the dead deserve it. In the car, the radio off played a noise just long enough to be doubt. I turned the key and the station found news. The anchor said weather. I heard mercy. By noon, I was standing again at the fence near the rail spur, the one that doesn't know which side of itself is the inside. The soot seam on the cinder block looked darker in day. I put my ear to it like an idiot and listened. 2 quick, 1 long, not a sound, but the sense of a rhythm taught to the stone by something that it wanted in or out. I said, "All right. Last favor for a while. Show me the 3rd room." The wind found a key and ran a scale through the chain links. The city doesn't do gratitude. It does alignment. And right then, for a breath, the angles stopped lying. There was a panel, of course. There is always a panel, painted to look like what it isn't, generous enough to admit a man who knows what hinges feel like under paint. I slid it back and breathed air that had not met the weather in a long time. Stairs that didn't want to be stairs went down. The light found me, the way bad light does, from a source that wasn't a bulb. The room at the bottom was small enough to be honest and large enough to be a sin. On the far wall, a line of soot that climbed and kept climbing past the edge of the room and into someplace my eyes could not follow. The ground hummed a note you only hear in your bones. The air licked my face once with heat and was done. On a crate, a cassette labeled in a hand that had forgotten cursive. A word that wasn't a word. Return. I reached for it knowing it would cost me a night of sleep and maybe my good opinion of the world. Before my fingers touched it, something not wind moved the hair on my arm. And then the room said my name in a voice that belonged to neither the living nor the dead, but to a city that had finally decided I'd paid enough to be told the one thing it never tells anyone for free. It told me who had made the first trade. It told me when, and it asked me whether I intended to make it right. The city told me a name and a date. Not Tree Frogs, we had him. Not the boys, we were learning him back to himself. It said a name I'd only seen once, 4 years after the rescue, in a column that should have been about help, and somehow ended up about money. A functionary who cut funds the family needed, while one of the monsters still drew his checks behind bars. Paperwork giveth, and paperwork taketh away. The date was older. A winter night in 76, when a different child disappeared, and the city learned it could live with that kind of math if no one forced the ledger open. If you think cities don't keep books, you haven't walked them long enough. Concrete is just a way of remembering without tears. That night, in the third room, the soot seam hummed a note that felt like a burned fingertip, and the cassette on the crate waited like a lesson plan. The label said return, in a hand that didn't love cursive. I pocketed it the way a man pockets a law he doesn't want to break in public. Upstairs, the panel slid back into being a wall, and the fence resumed its hobby of pretending to keep things apart. The rain quit, or tried to. The sky found the color of old tin. At the lab, we threaded the tape and let the needle draw its steno of the air. Hiss, then room tone with a higher ceiling than the van, lower than a church. The younger man again, zipper in his throat, reading from a page like he was trying to put distance between his mouth and his meaning. He said, return requires loss acknowledged. He said, names are handles. Remove them, and the jar does not open. He said, the city owns the nameless. He said, we traded noise for silence and were paid with a child. Then, like last time, the hiccup at 32 seconds, as if the world itself needed to swallow. Then my name, not from him, not from anyone in the room, shaped by air that hadn't met a tongue. The tech looked at me. I wrote down the 32, like a man who knows a number has become a door. You want me to say how sound bends physics. I won't. I can't. What I will say is that there are places in this town that amplify wrong things the way a good hall amplifies a soprano. There are scenes old culverts, bricked over utility runs, tunnels that started as rumors and got upgraded to fact by bored men with flashlights in the 40s that take one kind of noise and return another. You feel them before you know them. I've been standing on them for years. I never learned their names. The mother called to say the bruise had faded to the kind of outline you get when you press a leaf under paper and rub with a soft pencil. She said, the shape's clearer. I said, that's what happens when a mark decides it wants to be a story instead of a wound. She said, she's humming a different 3 notes now. Not the music box. Brighter. I told her bright is allowed. Then I asked, has she asked for the van in her sleep? There was a silence that wasn't empty. She said, last night she said, window, and then no, and then thank you. She didn't know who she was talking to. I said, let her thank whoever made it stop. That afternoon, the DA's office wanted neat lines they could take to court again if anyone ever tried to appeal neat out of our verdicts. I gave them what I had that would survive sunlight, the sermons, the photos. The notebook with commandments written in block letters like a man casting spells. The partial print that might become a full match if the right hand touched the right door tomorrow. I did not give them soot that climbs or halls, that whisper, or tapes that say my name like I'm a password for mercy. Some truths die on contact with institutional air. At dusk, I drove to the bridge where the creek lies about being a river and stood under it until the day forgot itself. The man who'd traded fear for honesty the day before didn't come back. He didn't owe me 2 miracles. The concrete hummed in the way things hum when they're deciding which parts of themselves to admit. Above me, car tires sang their songs about friction and intention. In my pocket, the matchbox with the moth felt like a joke getting heavy. I set it on the ledge like an offering and said, "Keep what's yours and leave the rest of us alone." The water didn't answer. It didn't need to. People think a solved case ends in a day. It ends in 3s. 3 days of paperwork. 3 quiet calls at the wrong hour. 3 moments when you think you've run out of kindness and find a little more because someone younger is watching. Night 1 after the 3rd room, the hallway bulb stayed on like it had decided to grow up. Night 2, the radio stayed off like it respected boundaries. Night 3, the city tested me. A call from an unlisted number, a breath, a music box 3 bars, and a child's voice saying, "Not this time." Then the click of a line that had done its job and retired. I sat with the dead dial tone and let my heart choose a tempo. Morning brought a letter that had walked through more hands than a church collection plate. A photocopy of a UPI brief from that winter, the one that starts, "Police confirmed today that a girl found in a van was reunited with her parents, and that 2 men were arrested on more charges than a calculator likes to display." The paper was the kind of gray that tells you machines did their best. The names were right. The place was right. The calendar matched the scar. Someone wanted me to remember the part of the story with edges that don't argue in court. Fine, I remembered. I can hold both in my head, the fact of steel and the superstition of soot. At the hospital, the girl stacked blocks in 3s without being told. She knocked twice, then once, and giggled like she had tricked gravity. Lavra stood by with a smile that could have paid a city's debts if cities took joy as legal tender. I said to the girl, "You want the window open." She shook her head no, and then yes, and then no again, which is about how choices work when you're learning that air can be both friend and bully. I told Lavra about the creek without telling her about the room. She said, "People bring candles to rivers all the time. Maybe we should bring moths to bridges." I said, "Let's not start a religion we can't finish." In the evening, the press called because they had heard a rumor that someone found additional materials. I gave them a sentence that's true in any weather. The case is closed where it must be and open where compassion insists. They didn't like that because it doesn't fit in a lower third. A younger version of me would have given them a quote with teeth. The older me wants the city to rest a minute without men like me using it for applause. And still, because this is how cities work, quiet did not equal peace. A boy on a BMX left a note rubber banded to my fence picket. The blue door is painted red now. Does that matter? I wrote back on the note, "Red is a color doors choose when they want to be seen." He stole the note back like a magician palming a coin. Good. Let him keep the ritual. We all need a part. I wish I could tell you that was the end of the unexplainable. It wasn't. The unexplainable has seasons. That week it had a harvest. On Thursday, the janitor with the rented jacket turned up in a mugshot for trespass 2 districts over, carrying a spiral notebook with rules written in the same all-caps hand. A copy, a disciple's hand, not the original. On Friday, a caller with a voice like sandpaper asked whether we had found the place where the moths go when they're done. Saturday morning, the mother left a message timed for a minute. I wouldn't answer. She said the bruise was now the color of the skin around it, and only the idea of it remained. She said, "Is there a word for a bruise that decides to be a story?" I said to the empty room, "There ought to be. You want a straight line? I will give you one." There was a trade before the trade that stole the girl. Men gave something sacred to a place under the city and asked for anonymity in return. They got it. The city, being a city, doesn't know the difference between protecting a saint and protecting a liar. It protects. It doesn't curate. Decades later, men who believe words can dress wounds without cleaning them used the same seam and asked for shelter for their van and their hunger. The seam obliged, because that's what seams do when you don't stitch them right the first time. We stitched it, not with concrete. With witnesses? With names returned to the people who own them. With a child's hum that picked a new 3 notes, and a mother who learned the shape of a better question. Do I think the city loved us back? No. I think it was tired of holding in what didn't belong to it. I think it exhaled, and we called that grace. I think the tape said my name, because I was the one stupid enough to listen with the player off and the lights on. Men like me are useful. We are not special. We are tools, good ones on good days, dull ones on others, and the miracle is not that a tape recorded a whisper. It's that a child slept through applause that wanted to make itself the story and woke to choose different music. What remains is simple and not. The return cassette on my desk, tagged and logged. The soot seam in a report that says residual combustion artifact, because even poets have to eat. A bridge with a matchbox under it, holding a moth that taught me the price of light. A map with a pin. I will not move again unless the city asks me to do something kinder than knocking twice and once. And a ledger, which looks better than it did in February of '82, even if it will never be clean, because no ledger is not in a town with this much living in it. If you'll stay with me, the next part stops being about rooms and starts being about people. What the boy told me when he found a word he could trust. What the younger man said when the zipper in his throat broke and he had to use sounds instead of scripts. What the mother asked me to do that no policy manual covers. And what the city wanted in exchange for going quiet again. And the one more name the tape gave me when I wasn't listening to it, and it played anyway. The city didn't ask out loud. It never does. It nudged. A map pin warming in my pocket. A pay phone coughing 3 tones, and then forgetting it had a voice. A cassette labeled return sitting on my desk like a dare. If there's a gift in getting older, it's knowing when to say yes before the terms are printed. I said yes quietly, to a room with no one in it, and a skyline that pretended to be asleep. That morning, Matt asked for shoes with laces. It shouldn't have mattered. It did. Velcro is for speed. Laces are for choosing. I took him to a strip mall store that smelled like rubber and teenage ambition. He picked a pair the color of fresh asphalt and tied them with a concentration that made the clerk stop pretending to inventory socks. On the way out, he said, "If I undo them, will I go back?" I said, "Laces aren't a spell. They're a promise." He nodded like he wanted promises to be simple, and I had disappointed him only a little. The younger man, the one with the zipper in his voice, had stopped shaking. That's worse, sometimes. Shaking is a kind of truth. Stillness is a decision. We sat in a room that tries to look like it doesn't belong in a station. Soft chairs, bad art, a plant that refuses to die out of spite. He looked at the floor and said, "I was supposed to read." I said, "You can stop." He said, "He will know." I said, "He's not a god." He said, "He talked to the city like it was, and sometimes the city said yes." I said, "The city says yes to gravity and pipes and men who knock twice. It doesn't say yes to hearts. That part is on us." When he finally met my eyes, they were older than the lines on his face. He said, "Before the girl, there was a trade for a car that never got tickets. Before that, a trade for a job that never checked references. Before that, a trade for not being looked at when I should have been. He laughed without humor. He said, I was on the receiving end. He was the priest. I was the choir. I said, choirs can stop singing. He said, not in his church. I said, this isn't his church anymore. We didn't get a confession. We got something truer, fatigue and a willingness to let the truth exist in the room without being stabbed. He said, under the creek, under the moth place, there's a crawl space where someone wedged a tin of teeth. Not human, animal. He said, he called it tithing the dark. My skin tried to leave the room, and I asked it to stay. I asked him who brought them. He said, not me. I said, him. He didn't say yes, didn't say no. He said, it smelled like pennies and rain. That was enough. The mother had learned to narrate without collapsing. That's a graduate skill. She asked me, how do I tell her about fear without teaching her to worship it? I said, you don't use its name as a finish line. You use it as a weather report. Bring a coat. Go anyway. She said, you talk like a coach. I said, coaches get better seats than cops. She laughed for the first time, without asking permission from sorrow. I wanted to frame the sound and hang it where bureaucrats file their reports. Night laid its hand on the city, and the city didn't flinch. Good. I drove to Islay Creek and found the bridge hunched like a shoulder in the rain's memory. The matchbox with the moth had collected 2 more. That wasn't my doing. Things just find each other when they've learned a secret handshake. I set the box deeper under the ledge and told the concrete, this is me paying attention. Then I went where nobody sensible goes after midnight, back to the 3rd room. The panel sulked. Hinges remember hands. I worked it slow like an apology. The air down there had warmed a degree no thermostat could measure. On the crate, the cassette still read return, as if it had been patient with me and expected the favor returned. I didn't play it in the room because this city has rules, and one is, don't hand the echo its own teeth. I climbed back up, shut the panel, walked the fence line until my heartbeat felt like mine and not something I'd borrowed from a generator, then headed to the lab. The tape behaved like it wanted to be understood. Hiss, breath, the younger man's voice reciting less, straining more. He said, return is not a door, it's a decision. He said, the city will hold what we ask it to if we call it by a name it recognizes. He said, names begin with knocking. He knocked twice on wood near the mic, and the tape took the sound and made a 3rd knock on its own. The tech pulled his hands back like the machine had teeth. He rewound. It did it again. Knock, knock, knock. Machines don't improvise. Rooms do. Then came something new. Not my name, not anyone's. A word like a street that you can't quite pronounce until you've walked it. The tech turned a dial with the care of a man disarming his own cynicism. Out of the noise came 3 syllables. They weren't English. They didn't need to be. I recognized the sound the way you recognize the outline of your own house in fog. The creek's old name, the one indigenous mouths formed before maps were arguments. I wrote it down like a thief who intends to give the stolen thing back. It's funny how, when you finally hear a word you needed, the next step is always physical. We went with shovels? No, with bolt cutters and good gloves. Under the bridge, in the culvert where the city still pretends water will keep its promises, there's a seam in the concrete that looks like every other seam until you kneel for it. The bolt cutter took 2 tries. The grate coughed like a smoker. Behind it, a space just big enough for bad ideas. I went first, because of course I did. The air said coin, iron, animal. My light said more than I wanted to know. The tin was there, a cookie tin with cheerful daisies that had learned to lie. The lid stuck. The second try made a sound like a cry swallowed. Inside, teeth, not human, no. Animal small, domestic, some clearly cat, some not. Arranged, not dunked. Ranks like someone's idea of prayer. Beneath the teeth, a paper folded tight as a kept secret. I used the tip of my glove like a gentleman. The paper had a word written in the same all caps a notebook used. Receipts, below, dates. Some matched our case window. Others went back years. Tithes to the dark, he'd said. Paid on time. I stood where a city should never have to host a church, and let anger be the heat the room lacked. We photographed because the honest world demands photographs. We bagged because ritual without rigor is only ghost hunting. Back topside, the night had found a weather pattern I didn't hate. A train far off said its one long sentence. On the bridge, a teenager tagged something in a hand that had learned art without teachers. He looked at me like I was history, and at my gloves like I was important. I said, "You're spelling right." He said, "Someone taught me." I said, "Keep what's useful." He said, "That's hard." I said, "It's the only hard worth doing." We did the boring heroic things next. Warrants, affidavits, rope the DA can climb when the public wants to know why men in orange get to eat 3 times a day. We folded the tin into the story in a place the jury could understand. Rituals have receipts. Receipts make patterns. Patterns make guilt look less like a mood and more like a plan. The younger man watched the process like someone watching the ocean be measured. He said, "Will it stop him?" I said, "Men stop. Stories don't. What we can do is make the story less hospitable to monsters." The mother asked me to do a thing no manual covers. She said, "Will you be there the first night she sleeps without a light? Not in the room outside, on the porch, the way a lighthouse keeps ships from deciding to make friends with rocks." It was not my job. It was my job. I brought coffee and a jacket and stood where the porch steps creak and the streetlight hums. At 2, the house sighed the way a body does when a fever breaks. At 3, the dog next door agreed not to bark. At 4, my knees made their complaint. At 5, I went home and slept like the light had chosen to forgive me personally. Mac's window finally opened with permission and responsibly bad supervision. He pushed it up an inch, which is a measure nobody tells you how to teach. He said, "That's enough." He said it like a man who had learned hunger's antonym. We sat and let the real air bully our cheeks. He said he used to talk about the creek like it was a woman who owed him favors. I said, "The creek owes nobody a thing." He said, "Then why did it pay?" I said, "Because men make it carry their debts when they can't." He said, "Are you a man?" I said, "Working on it." The janitor with the borrowed jacket made bail on the trespass and left town in a bus that believed in second chances. The disciple notebooks dried up as if the copyist had run out of religion. The BMX kid left one last note on my fence. I painted the door back to blue. I wrote back, "Doors like honest colors." He took that and did whatever a child does with an adult sentence that might grow into a tool one day. What you're waiting for, what you deserve, is the part where the city names its price. It did. It asked me to stop carrying things that didn't belong to me past their usefulness. The tapes? Logged and filed where they can't recruit. The moths? Buried under the bridge with 3 small stones. The matchbox? Empty, cleaned, returned to the drawer where normal men keep bandages and batteries. The pin? Back on the map, steady as a town that has not yet learned your name. The soot seam? We tested. We argued. We wrote residual aerosol deposition and pretended our pens weren't shaking. Then, one quiet Sunday, I went with a brush and a bucket and scrubbed until the black turned gray, and the gray turned suggestion, and the suggestion decided to stop showing off. Cities don't forget, but they can stop advertising. The returned cassette played one more time, on its own, in my living room. Volume low the way a person with manners speaks before coffee. 32 seconds. Breath. Not my name. A new word. Keep. Then the machine clicked. The tape stopped. and the counter blinked 033, like a joke only I was in the room to not laugh at. I ejected the cassette, labeled it with the date, and let it be done. If this sounds like closure, it isn't. Closure is a realtor's promise. What you get is maintenance. Porch lights left on for the right reasons. Windows opened an inch to let air learn how to behave. Boys tying laces. Mothers naming the day's weather without apologizing to yesterday. What you get is a city that hums at a tolerable pitch most nights and saves its 3 knocks for when someone, foolish enough to answer, also happens to be around. There's one more thing, because there always is. The name the city gave me buried in the column about funds and fairness. A man who made a decision that hurt the right people and helped the wrong one turned out to be a hinge. Not because he was a secret villain with a lair under a bridge. Because he was ordinary, and the ordinary uncorrected becomes permission. I knocked on his door at noon on a Tuesday and used my nicest voice. We talked about budgets like they're weather. We talked about triage like it's a virtue. We talked until he said I was only doing my job. I said my job is to make sure only doesn't excuse what it covers. He didn't like me after. That's all right. He thinks cities are numbers. I think they're people. We're both right, and one of us still has to go stand on porches at 2 in the morning. You wanted a solved case. You got one. You wanted the unexplainable. You got that too, but not the kind that eats the story. The kind that seasons it and tells you there are older languages under our streets. And sometimes, when we do our work with care, those languages help make a child's room quiet again. If you'll stay for the next part, the city owes you a coda. The boy's first joke that landed on purpose. The mother's day one ritual when the bruise became a memory with soft edges. The younger man's letter from county, written without a script. And the last time the map pin warmed a year later for a different child's name. And the way 3 knocks led not to soot, but to something like Thanksgiving. A year is enough time for a city to pretend it has learned the lesson, and for people to decide whether to believe it. The headlines aged into anniversaries. The porch light across from the mother's house learned to stay on without buzzing. Mac grew into his laces. He learned 2 jokes that belonged to him and 1 that didn't, and he stopped flinching when doors discovered their hinges. The first joke landed at a picnic table behind the community center where good intentions and potato salad meet. He said, "You know why moths love streetlights? Because they don't have rent." It wasn't funny, not really, until he got to the face deadpan, one eyebrow trying to become a kite. People laughed because they were supposed to, and because he had asked them to properly. He looked at me like he'd just lifted a thing too heavy for him last year and found it manageable now. I said, "Timing is 90% mercy." He said, "What's the other 10? I said, "Making them feel safe." He nodded like he'd add that to a pocket where he kept good sentences for later. The mother made a ritual out of ordinary days. Day 1 when the bruise became an idea instead of a mark. She stirred pancake batter in a glass bowl and let her daughter pinch sugar between forefinger and thumb the way a kid pinches light. A moth, of course, came to the window screen and didn't try to be an omen. The kid tapped the pane and said a word that wasn't moth or butterfly, but meant friend who knows the way to the porch. They ate pancakes without negotiating bites with ghosts. After, the mother stood at the sink and didn't cry. She breathed like a person who could imagine a plan that lasted longer than a week. When she called, she said, "I think we can stop naming fear like it pays the mortgage." I said, "It's always month to month with fear. Raise the rent." The younger man sent a letter from county that tried not to be a sermon and almost succeeded. He wrote in block letters out of habit because scripts are treacherous. He said, "I am not asking you to forgive me because I don't have the right calculus for that. I am asking you to remember that I was a chore boy in a church I did not pick." He said he used words like metamorphosis because they made him feel larger than his radius. He said, "I am trying to learn small words that don't hide knives." He thanked me for one sentence I barely remembered saying. Choirs can stop singing. He underlined it once, which is the prison version of tears. I wrote back 2 lines, like a man who knows not to adopt the pen panther style of men with too much time. Small words, new choices. Practice is proof. He wrote again later to ask what to do about sleep. I said, "Count doors you can open from the inside." The tapes stayed in their labeled boxes in an evidence room that has outlived 8 chiefs and 2 ideologies. The soot scene faded into whatever walls become after you scrub them with apology. Under the bridge, the matchbox was empty, and I left it that way because sometimes the most respectful act is not to fill a container just because it can be filled. The map learned manners and only warmed when my hand was already near, like a dog that no longer feels the need to prove loyalty. You expect maybe a final haunting. You get a coda instead. It came on a Thursday in late fall when the bay decides to smell expensive, and the sky looks like it worked late and forgot to clock out. The pin warmed, now to burn, a nudge. Different quadrant. Different ledger. South and east, past the yards that have learned better PR, near a school where the handball court carries the stories of children who will outgrow each other and then remember, fondly, the names they threw at friends. 3 knocks, not on doors. In my chest, like the body had learned the city's rhythm for the sake of efficiency. I drove without sirens, because drama is for later. The corner lot wore a chain-link fence like a shrug. Inside, a prefab classroom sat on blocks that had seen more winters than they admitted. A custodian real this time. No costume smoked a cigarette, like half a prayer, and gestured with his chin to where a little boy sat under the metal stairs, arms around his knees, face in the space between fear and waiting. He had a shoelace in his hand and the know-how to make it a rope or a ribbon, and was deciding which. I sat on the step above him at a respectful angle, the way you learn to sit near dogs with opinions. I said nothing until he said something that was not an apology. He didn't. He said, "The noise is too big." I said, "That's what grown-ups call a Thursday." He said, "I want a smaller day." I said, "We can build one." He looked up like he didn't believe me and was willing to be surprised. He said, "You talk like my grandpa." I said, "That's the nicest insult I've had this week." We built a smaller day out of 3 tasks. Find a pencil that likes us, write a word that isn't a teacher's, and open a window 1 inch. He did all 3 like a man who had been asked to hand over his anger and was choosing to hand over something else first. His shoelace made it back into the eyelets without becoming a noose. He wasn't missing. He had decided to practice it. Some children rehearse silence. You have to introduce them to noise that doesn't bite. On the way out, the custodian said, "Thought about calling police. Then I thought about calling you." He tapped the paper where my name had been printed a year before. Newsprint outlives a man's dignity by months. I said, "You did the exact right thing. You waited 12 minutes and then went looking." He said, "I'm nobody." I said, "You're a hinge. Doors don't swing without hinges." He took that compliment and put it in his pocket, where men keep flints and unpaid parking tickets. A week later, the map warmed one more time gentle, like a hand on your shoulder reminding you to stand up straight. The pin pointed not to a seam or a panel, or a room pretending to be a hallway. It pointed to a block party flyer stapled to a telephone pole on a street that used to be a rumor and had become a neighborhood. The flyer was handmade, marker bold with joy, 3 bands, 1 grill, kids chalking the asphalt into galaxies. In the bottom corner, in a small script that only someone looking would see, 3 dots in a triangle. Knock, knock, hold. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was gratitude wearing a new shirt. We showed up the mother, the kid who stacked blocks into jokes, The younger man's letter folded small and safe in my wallet. Leore carrying a foil pan of something that makes friends. Me with a bag of buns like an uncle who learned hospitality late. Nobody made speeches. Someone brought a music box that had learned a happier song. Near dusk, streetlights made their agreements with moths, and the moths did what moths do. Approached, reconsidered, found a distance that felt like living. The girl, older by 1,000 gentle mornings, took my hand without asking, because some permissions you don't need forms for. She said, "You hear it?" I said, "What?" She said, "The city saying sorry." I said, "Maybe it's just the grill." She said, "Maybe. We let maybe keep the peace." A man I didn't know handed me a paper plate, loaded like a dare, and said, "Aren't you the guy from the tape story?" I said, "No, I'm the guy from the porch." He laughed like he knew both were true, and neither was the whole of it. Mac did card tricks for kids who pretended not to be impressed. The mother placed a candle on a cupcake and didn't make it about survival. She made it about Tuesday. Lavra danced like someone with a great secret who had decided to tell the pavement instead of a person. For a breath, the ledger looked friendly. You want the epilogue or the city never knocks again. It will. They always do. But the knocks change key. They become calls to show up for simpler things. A neighbor's loose back door. A teacher's thin patience on a hard day. A kid who thinks windows only open all the way, or not at all, and needs to be taught about inches. The unexplainable doesn't go away. It learns its manners. It stops recruiting. It lets people be the miracle instead of the glitch. A month after the block party, a letter arrived on plain paper with handwriting that once would have tried to be beautiful, and now was something better, legible. The younger man wrote, "I found a word." He underlined it twice. He wrote, "Enough. Enough of rules that make harm smarter than love. Enough of doors that open only from one side. Enough of prayers to things that don't care." He said, "When I get out, I will live so small that the city can't find me unless it needs someone to sweep." I wrote back, "Sweepers make the world possible. Don't mistake quiet for small." The last warm pin came on a morning. I was tying my shoe and thinking of nothing important coffee. The weather that never keeps its promises. A new ache in a knee that used to forgive me more. The pin didn't point anywhere weird. It just made my fingers pause and remember. You are not done, but you are allowed to rest between errands. I touched the map like a man touches an old dog's head when the vet says good heart, and means time is kind for now. You asked for a solved case, and you stayed for the part where solved doesn't mean silent. You asked for unexplainable, and you got the kind that doesn't demand worship-only attention. If you'll take one more turn with me, the last two parts won't be about tapes or soot or doors. They'll be about the ordinary miracles, what a porch looks like at 2 a.m. when fear has finally moved out. How a city sounds when it hums gratitude under the traffic. How a girl's 3-note song becomes a family language. How a man in a coat too old for dignity learns to count his breaths and call that prayer without needing concrete to answer. And the last favor the city asked, a year to the day, when the 3 knocks came from a place with no walls at all. And the answer wasn't a key or a shovel, but a chair pulled up beside someone who thought they were alone. The last favor didn't come as a knock on a door or a tape playing itself. It arrived as absence, the kind that makes a room feel larger than it should. The mother called and didn't ask for anything. She said, "The house is quiet, and I don't know what to do with that." I said, "You can leave it be. Quiet doesn't have to be solved." She said, "I keep waiting for something to ask permission to come in." I said, "Then maybe this time let silence be the guest that stays as long as it wants and never outwears its welcome." Mac found work sweeping in the mornings at a bakery that thinks sugar can be a civic project. He liked unlocking things on purpose. He liked turning the sign from closed to open in a script that has made shopkeepers brave for 100 years. He showed me how to proof dough, like he was teaching me to calm skittish horses. He said, bread only rises when it's left alone at the right time. I said, men too. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The girl sang her 3 notes, like a password that opens every room she enters. At a checkup, the doctor asked her what she likes best about days, and she said, when they don't end at the same time every time. The mother told me this, and I said, that's how you know a house is healing. Bedtime negotiates with joy instead of fear. The bruise was a memory now, and the memory behaved. It visited when called and left when asked. If that sounds like magic, it is the ordinary kind, the only kind worth practicing. The younger man wrote from state instead of county this time. The letter had a new economy. He had found edit. He wrote, I have learned to sleep with the light off. I leave the window an inch. I say the creek's old name without asking it for anything. He said, I sweep. They let me, and the broom makes a noise that sounds like work. He included a drawing of a moth, plain, not holy. He wrote, I don't want to be forgiven if that means forgetting. I want to be useful. I wrote back, usefulness is forgiveness in motion. Sweep and sleep, repeat. The city watched us practice ordinary. Its hum was different, lower, the way an engine sounds after a tune-up by a mechanic who loves her job. The map pin stopped warming and started doing something kinder. It cooled my thumb when I touched it in summer. The porch light across from the mother's house learned the trick of inviting moths without burning them. An LED with a color so uninteresting even insects knew to keep a respectful distance. Progress looks like that. Less drama, more function. Then came the call with no return number, no breath, no cleverness. A recorded voice said, a time and a place. A park bench that has hosted confessions and sandwiches in equal measure for decades. Noon. Thursday. I brought nothing but the habit of showing up. The bench was taken by a woman who wore her grief like a jacket she'd had tailored. She said, you're the porch man. I said, on my better nights. She said, my nephew is making plans with silence. He sits by windows and counts panes like they're rungs. He wants to disappear in the polite way. No mess, no witnesses. I said, that's not silence. That's rehearsal. She said, the rehearsal is going well. We are all minor experts in somebody's crisis. Mine involves smaller days and windows that open an inch at a time. I asked for a street, a number, a time. She gave me a block and a frame, Tuesdays after 4. I walked past the building 3 times in 3 days at 4:07 and learned the rhythm of its doors. On Thursday, the boy was there. 13, a kind of fragile that looks like anger on bad days and hunger on good ones. His shoelaces were perfect. His eyes were gray, the color of a road after rain that hasn't decided if it will evaporate. I sat on the stoop 2 steps down because heights matter. I said, city's loud. He said, it is. I said, want a smaller day. He said, I don't want a day at all. I said, then let's build a smaller hour. He didn't tell me to leave. He didn't ask for a badge. He wanted to be inconvenienced by kindness without having to be grateful. We made a list that wouldn't make anyone proud except the right people. Drink water, text an adult 3 words that are not an apology. Tie laces again, because hands can be recalled from cliffs by work. He did the first. He negotiated the second. He tied the third like a man holding on. He said, do you hear the 3 knocks? I said, sometimes. He said, me too. I said, we don't have to answer. He said, what if it's for someone else? I said, then we call a neighbor. He laughed like I'd told him a magic trick. Neighbors, plural, are a technology we keep forgetting. He came down a step. The window behind him cracked open an inch. A radio inside muttered something about weather that was probably a lie. He said, did you ever want to be someone else? I said, every day until it mattered. He said, when did it matter? I said, when a kid I still call by the wrong name, learned to tie laces that stayed tied even when the world tried to trip him. He looked at my shoes like they held answers. He said, I have to be me, then. I said, only for the next hour. He said that I can do. There's a discipline to not making a scene out of a rescue. We passed each other on the same block 3 Thursdays in a row at 4:07 and pretended we were on our separate errands. He wore an expression boys wear when they are secretly proud of not needing to be saved. The aunt texted once. He asked for pancakes on a Tuesday. Pancakes on a Tuesday is a language parents learn in their best lives. I told her to keep the window inch rule and to let silence visit without making it a shrine. That should have been the end of the city's ask. It wasn't. It was the ramp to the last favor. A year to the day after the tape whispered keep, the city called with no infrastructure at all. No phones, no radios, no lights. It asked by letting a storm roll in from the Pacific with a posture that made old buildings remember the names of their builders. Rain wrote its shorthand on every surface. The bridge at Islay sang in a key it hadn't used since men wore hats unironically. The map pin was cool and stayed cool, as if to say, not this tool, not today. I drove not to the yards or the creek or the old service door, but to a hospital corridor that smells the way hope smells when it's been washed in antiseptic and hard work. Laura had texted one word. Here, in a family lounge, the mother sat with a paper cup and the expression women get when they're telling pain that it can have this hour and no more. The girl older now, her hum of family language slept 2 floors up, after a routine thing that never feels routine when it involves a child you got back from a van. I took the chair beside the mother, because sometimes the only answer is a chair and time. We didn't talk for a while. The storm held the building in its hands and shook it like a toy that refused to break. She said, I keep thinking I should have learned how to not be frightened by now. I said, being frightened is what careful looks like on the inside. She said, I don't want to teach her fear as a virtue. I said, teach her attention. Teach her neighbors. Teach her pancakes on Tuesdays. She smiled because she has learned to take medicine without arguing with the spoon. The lights flickered twice and once. She flinched and apologized to the air. I said, that's not an omen. That's a generator clearing its throat. She said, do you hear it? I said, the 3 knocks? Yes, she said. What does it want? I said, it wants us to practice being alive in bad weather. She nodded like I'd named a saint she could believe in. We sat. We listened to the hospital do its part for the city. Nurses walking like angels who don't need wings. Orderlies moving furniture that weighs more than forgiveness. A joke from a night shift doctor that had served him well for years. On the TV in the corner, the weather pretended to predict itself. I told her the story of the boy on the stoop without names. I told her about windows and inches, and how 3 knocks can be a test of whether community still works. She said, do you ever wish the city loved us? I said, I think it tolerates us until we give it a reason to hum. She said, like tonight. I said, like tonight. At 3 a.m., the storm stepped back to admire its work. The generator quit showing off. The soda machine decided to become a frog again instead of a prince. A lullaby, no. Not that one came from 2 floors up. A real one. A mother's voice on a ward where fear is a tenant with an end date. The mother next to me breathed like a steady metronome, and I let myself be furniture. The good kind, solid, not precious. On the walk to the car at dawn, the street was a mirror that had learned honesty. The matchbox under the bridge would be dry again by afternoon. The pin on the map would stay cool until the city needed me to open a window for someone else. The cassette labeled return would remain a rectangle with magnetized memory in a box where nobody without clearance could make a religion out of it. The soot scene would remain faint enough to remind Not enough to recruit? At home, the hallway bulb new, polite came on without theater. I made coffee, 2 mugs. One for me, one to carry to a porch that wasn't mine in a neighborhood that had decided to trust me with its quiet. The girl would be home by noon. The mother would stir pancakes like a priest with a kinder book. Mac would sweep flour into meanings and teach someone to let dough rise without nagging it. The younger man would push a broom in a corridor where doors only lock from the outside and call that proof that the world had learned at least one thing. And me? I'd sit on a step at 2 in the morning every so often, not because the city demanded it, but because gratitude is a habit you practice standing up. If the knocks came, I'd count them and decide if they were weather or work. If a boy counted panes like rungs, I'd count with him until he forgot the number and remembered the view. If a mother picked up a phone and called no one just to hear a line carry her breath, I'd answer anyway. You came for a solved case, and we walked all the way to a city learning better music. There is one part left, and it belongs to the girl. Not to the tape, not to the men who mistook long words for wisdom, not to the soot scene or the bridge or the map. The last favor the city asked was to listen when she decided to give the van back its last stolen thing, its name, and to let that name change one more time what we believe about what we owe each other when the weather turns and the streetlights hum. The name belonged to her, not the one the court typed, not the one on the hospital bracelet, not the one we carried like a lantern through 10 months of darkness. A child's power is small and exact, to take something stolen and rename it true. The van had been a room, a noun for fear. She stood in a kitchen that smelled like pancakes and Tuesday and said, that wasn't a van. That was the wrong kind of house. Then she said the right kind of house is where the window is a friend. She didn't say this to perform. She said it to set the world down in the right place. That morning, the porch had learned a new quiet. Not the kind that waits for shoes to sprint, but the kind that makes coffee taste better. The mother handed me a mug and didn't explain her hands the way people do when they're worried you'll judge how they shake. We listened to the small traffic of a neighborhood that keeps its promises. A dog that barks in complete sentences. A teenager practicing reverse badly and bravely. A mail carrier who knows where to knock softly. The girl hummed her 3 notes down the hall, and the house hummed back like a throat clearing to sing along. You learn not to force the last chapter. It comes when it wants, always sideways, always honest. When it arrived, it was an invitation folded in marker and tape. School show and tell, the kind that scares adults more than children. An audience, a microphone, the possibility of a word said too early or too late. The mother asked if I'd sit in the back like furniture. Furniture is a promotion I've earned and accept gladly. I took the seat that never squeaks until you need it to be quiet. She walked on stage with a shoelace bracelet and a look that told the world she had been coached by joy rather than fear. She held a jam jar with a paper lid punched full of small holes that let air come and go like a polite guest. Inside, a moth, no drama, no halo tucked its wings like it had learned not to apologize for wanting light. She said, "This is a friend who knows how to not get burned if you help." The teacher smiled the way good teachers do, proud without making ownership a temptation. The room had the usual coughs and whispers. She tapped the jar, gentle, and the moth repositioned itself like a shy musician in a small band. She said, "We had a van, but it wasn't a van. It was a wrong house on wheels. My mom says we don't live there now. We have windows that are friends." And then she did the thing the city had asked me to be brave enough to hear. She gave the van back its last stolen thing, its name. She said the wrong house's name out loud, the one the men had given it like an altar, the cocoon. Then she shook her head. No, not cocoon. A box, and boxes don't get to keep people. Silence held that small room. An adult cleared a throat. A child somewhere whispered wow in the voice children reserve for small miracles with no fireworks. She lifted the lid, let the moth step onto her knuckle, and walked it to the open window. An inch at first, then 2, then 3, because God help us, sometimes you get to open the window all the way. The moth hesitated and then did what moths do. It chose. Out into daylight, not designed for it, tracing a path that looked like doubt and was only air. Applause, yes, but gentle, as if clapping too loud could break the spell. The mother stood in a doorway with a hand over her mouth and learned she didn't need the hand anymore. I sat back and watched a city cash a debt without making a speech. On my phone, a text from Lavra. "You're at the show?" I wrote back, "First row of the last chapter." She sent a heart, and then, because she's better than superstition, a photo of the porch at noon. The light off, the window cracked, the quiet behaving. After, on the playground, she found me with the gravity of a person negotiating her first autograph. She said, "You were in my tape." I said, "I was in a lot of tape." She said, "The one that says keep." I said, "What should I keep?" She looked past me at the handball wall, where 2 boys played a game older than both of them. She said, "Keep the windows open an inch." I said, "Yes, ma'am." Then she said, "And keep the lights that don't hurt." I said, "I will make a list." Mac showed up with flour on his jacket and a grin that said he'd burned a batch and laughed about it, which is a species of recovery most men never find. He handed the girl a napkin with a small, perfect cinnamon roll inside and said, "This one knows how to cool before you eat it." She said, "Someone taught it patience." He shrugged like patience was a trick he'd added to his small repertoire and didn't trust yet. The younger man's latest letter sat in my pocket, folded like a truce. I didn't take it out. Today wasn't about paper. On the way home, the map pin didn't warm. It didn't need to. The city had moved the lesson from pins and knocks to something easier to miss. Traffic that makes space. Neighbors who look up. Crosswalks where people slow because someone taught them how to be a hinge in a machine that wants to be a blade. Under the bridge, the matchbox was still empty. I left a stone on it anyway. Habit is hope with boots on. At my house, the hallway bulb did its job. No theater. No pulses. The cassette labeled Return stayed on a shelf in a box behind other boxes, solid as a retired tool. I made coffee and sat with a silence that did not audition for menace. The radio, off, stayed off. When it finally spoke, it was the news doing weather and a baseball score that didn't matter, and a story about a school raising money for a library. The city sounded busy with the right things. For a long time, I thought grace was loud. Sirens loud. Applause loud. Tape hiss turned into miracles loud. It isn't. Grace is 3 knocks at a door you can choose not to answer because you taught your neighbors the rhythm too. Grace is a mother teaching the difference between moth and butterfly without turning it into a religion. Grace is a boy sweeping at dawn because someone showed him how to proof go and call that patience. Grace is a van losing its capital letter. That night, out of habit, I walked the block. Old wood houses leaned like relatives in photographs. A porch light hummed in a key so dull, even the bugs took a night off. Somewhere, the creek rehearsed under concrete for its 1 night a year as a river. I stopped by the map on the wall, and without theatrics, pressed the pin flat to the paper. "Stay," I said. Not a command. A request. Before sleep, the phone lit with a message from a number that didn't want to be known. It said only, "Thank you for chairs." No name, no need. I pictured a bench, a stoop, a hospital lounge, a porch at 2 a.m., a classroom window lifted 1 inch, a handball wall reflecting a ball, and a boy's better impulse. Chairs, of course. This whole year had been chairs pulled to the edge of fear, until fear decided It didn't like company and left. In the morning, because men of a certain age need rituals that don't ruin anyone's day, I drove to the creek and stood on the bridge. Below, water did its best impression of a plan. I said the creek's old name like a hello and not a spell. The city didn't answer. It didn't have to. The city and I had settled into a friendship that looked like boundaries and sounded like kids on bikes making a racket that tells you you're doing something right. I left a fresh matchbox under the ledge, empty, on purpose. You wanted a solved case. It is solved in all the places that matter in court. You wanted unexplainable phenomena. You met a city with seams and echoes, and a habit of letting 3 knocks mean different things until you teach it better. But the final record, the one without labels, is simple. A child was taken and returned. 10 months were lost and respent with interest in the form of ordinary days. A tape whispered keep, and keeping turned out to be chairs, windows, laces, pancakes on Tuesdays, lights that don't hurt, and names returned to their owners. If the city calls again, and it will, in the voice of a neighbor, or a boy counting pains, or a mother deciding whether to hum, we'll answer the way I was taught by a girl who renamed the van. Boxes don't get to keep people. We do, in the ways that don't burn. We keep each other with inches of air and cups of coffee and the decency to sit quietly through a storm. And if you ever hear 3 knocks on a night when the lights flicker twice and once, don't be afraid. It might be nothing but weather. Or it might be the city asking for the smallest favor. Pull up a chair.